Stephen Johnson has made a career writing books about the intersection of science, technology, and experience. His many works include the best-selling Where Good Ideas Come From, Everything Bad is Good for You, and How We Got to Now, which he later adapted into a popular series for PBS and the BBC. Johnson is also the creator of the influential online magazine Feed and the website plastic.com, and was one of Prospect Magazine's top 10 brains of the digital future. In his latest book, Wonderland, How Play Made the Modern World, Johnson considers the way novelty, delight, and amusement have driven innovation. The Times calls Wonderland a swashbuckling argument for the centrality of recreation to all of human history. I can tell you the book is as revelatory as it is entertaining, and it is also a beautiful object in and of itself. Please welcome Stephen Johnson.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate you quoting that Times review where they called it swashbuckling, because no one has ever called me or anything that I've ever produced swashbuckling before in my life. So that was a great breakthrough for me. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you all for coming out. This is my 10th book, and for some reason I think this is only the second time that I've come to Philadelphia on book tour, and so many people out tonight, so I'm going to make this a regular stop. I really appreciate it. The other time I was here, I wrote a book that is actually for sale out there, I saw, a few years ago, called The Invention of Air, which some of you might have read. And I came to Philadelphia because the kind of hero of that book is Joseph Priestley, the brilliant chemist and kind of political radical who ended up settling in Pennsylvania. And he was Ben Franklin's kind of best friend for a long period of time. And so we did an event, I think at the Franklin Library or Center or whatever it is. And when I arrived, it was this whole thing. I've written a lot about Franklin in this book, and I arrived, the kind of famous guy who played Ben Franklin, who I gather has passed on, was there like greeting me at the door, and it was this very strange conversation. It was like, I just wrote a book about you, because I just wrote this book about Joseph Priestley, and he was like, oh yes, Priestley, I knew him well, and he went into this whole long in-character monologue about Priestley. I was like, should I be pretending to be Priestley? Like, I don't know what the deal is with this. Anyhow, it was delightful, and it's great to be back, and I lived most of the year in New York, so it's silly that I'm not here more. This new book, Wonderland, is a sequel of sorts to the book and the show, How We Got to Now. And those of you who got a chance to read How We Got to Now or see the PBS series we did, you'll know that was a project really about the history of innovation and the history of ideas and technology that we sometimes take for granted. And in that project, I was trying to tell the kind of hidden histories behind these objects, everyday objects like the material glass or electric light, and to talk about both the kind of unsung heroes behind these innovations, but also the kind of unintended consequences of these innovations, how they changed society in all these unpredictable ways. And that was a really great format to work in. It was a great, incredibly fun format as a writer and as a researcher, and as making television series as well. And so I wanted to do something in that mode again, and we're actually hoping to make another 6 episodes of the show based on the material in this book. Fingers crossed that'll happen. But I also wanted with this book to not just tell 6 more stories of innovations. I wanted to have a kind of macro argument to this book. And so in many ways I think this is the better book, in that it is making this kind of interesting, someone say contrarian argument about what drives history. And that force that is at the center of the book, I call it in the subtitle play. It's really kind of a mix of things. It's play, delight, amusement, leisure. This book is a history of things that we did for fun, not because they had any immediate kind of survival value. They weren't particularly utilitarian in what they provided us. There was just something interesting and amusing that delighted our senses or our minds in some way when we experienced these things. And telling the history of delight, I think, in and of itself is worthwhile, because the world is filled with things that are fun and playful, and it's interesting to go back and track where those things came from. But there's a twist to this argument, which is to say that that history, which seems kind of from the outset to be frivolous or trivial or people just kind of messing around doing nothing productive, turns out to have been a tremendous driver of change and of new ideas in technology and in science and in politics and society and all these different ways. If you think back to your kind of high school world history class or European history class that you took, and if you think about what was conventionally kind of delineated as the prime movers of history, what are the forces that really drove historical change, you can probably come up with a list, on the fingers of two hands, right? There's the desire for kind of conquest and power, there's the march of freedom and democracy, there's scientific advances, there's wealth accumulation, there's tribalism and nationalism of various forms, religious beliefs, and so on. I would argue in that kind of pantheon of the prime movers of history, we should also include the history of delight and of play and of amusement, and that force, which is a very old part of our species. If you go back and look at the archaeological record, there's evidence of jewelry and ornamentation that dates back at least 100,000 years. There are bone flutes that are prominently featured in the music chapter in this book that date back at least 50,000. We have Paleolithic ancestors sitting there 50,000 years ago. There's a whole world of things that they have not invented yet. They've created, spears and a few tools to make garments and, a few other hunting tools and things like that, but they haven't invented the wheel, they haven't invented the alphabet, they haven't invented all sorts of devices, and yet they decided to invent musical instruments because there was something interesting, intoxicating in this sound. They didn't actually do anything for them functional, but it was provocative, it was evocative, it was something that was interesting to their ears, and so they took their ingenuity and crafted these new kind of proto-musical instruments in the shape of these bone flutes. So it's a very old part of what it means to be human. It's a deep recurring theme in our humanity, and it has led us to a tremendous series of new ideas that change the world. So what I want to do with our time is tell you a few stories from the book that hopefully will persuade you that there is some legitimacy to this crazy theme. And then we have a little bit of time for questions, and then I'm happy to sign books if people would like to do that. I want to talk really about three themes here that run through the book. The first is the role of play and delight in innovation, the role of play and delight in globalization, and the role of play and delight in democratization. Start with innovation. About 1,200 years ago, at the height of the Islamic Golden Age, there was an institution in Baghdad called the House of Wisdom. Had a great name. And this was at a point where Baghdad was probably the most advanced city in the world. It was a seat of great scientific and intellectual achievement. The city itself was very advanced just technologically. And the House of Wisdom was this extraordinary institution in that it was kind of a mix of a translation bureau, a think tank, and what we would now call a maker lab. It was filled with all these engineers working on interesting problems, building new designs, sharing them with the elites in this institution, and publishing their designs in books. There are these wonderful books that came out of the House of Wisdom with great titles like The Book of Ingenious Devices, which is a nice name. And they're beautifully, that we actually reproduced some of the, I'm not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to see this, but the beautiful kind of full color schematics of these devices that they created. And if you look at the actual engineering schematics, there are these very advanced technologies that are there, these flow regulators and float valves and water-based clocks that are more accurate than any clock that Europe would see for another 500 years. It's really cutting-edge engineering ideas. But if you look at what they're actually doing with all of that advanced science and engineering, almost every object in the book is a toy. It's a plaything. There's a little elephant that's also a clock. There's a little peacock where if you pull its tail feathers, it shoots out some water. There are little dancing fountains. There are a ton of kind of automated musical players, kind of fake, flautists playing flutes, back to flutes again, and animals making music. And so if you look at kind of step back for a second, you're like, well, this is just a book of child's play. And yet it contained within it some of the most advanced engineering ideas that the world had ever seen. They were just created purely for amusement. They didn't understand how these things would be ultimately transformative in kind of serious pursuits or applications. They started as toys. And one of the creations was not in the book itself, created by these three brothers in Baghdad known as the Banu Musa. And they didn't write about this in their kind of main manuscripts. And we almost lost any record of this device, but in a way it was the most important. And we found a manuscript about 100 years ago. I had nothing to do with it. That kind of kept this story alive, fortunately. And it was a device that the Banu Musa created that also had a great name, the instrument that plays itself. And the instrument was, technically it was an organ. It was a water-powered organ. But it actually was kind of designed to control an automated flute player, again, flutes, so that you would see this kind of robot playing the flute, and technically the music was coming from the organ below, but it sounded like he was actually playing on the flute. And the notes that the organ played were controlled by a rotating metallic cylinder that had little pins in it, each pin corresponding to the note and the length of the note that was being played, very much like a music box, if you remember music boxes from your childhood. And what made this device so radical, and the Banu Musa were very much aware of this, they spent a lot of this kind of manuscript describing their invention, focusing on this property of it, was that if you wanted it to play a different song, you could take out this cylinder, recode it with different pins representing different notes, different melodies, and put the new cylinder in the device, and it would play a completely different tune. This meant that this was arguably the first programmable machine in history. The whole idea of the difference between hardware and software becomes kind of thinkable at this moment in history, right? You have a machine that's not just good for doing one thing, but is open-ended. If you want it to do something else, well, you can encode new information, new instructions, and slide that into the machine, and it will behave in a completely different fashion. So it's a very profound idea. And what's, I think, so remarkable about this idea is that it stays kind of kept aloft by music for 500 or 600 years. It really in the form of these programmable music boxes, and then increasingly kind of programmable automatons whose behavior can be changed based on kind of code that's written into a rotating pin cylinder, the exact same structure. So by the 1700s, concentrated in France, but all throughout Europe, one of the great kind of amusements of the well-to-do and the elite are these automatons that are, in fact, the famous writer is apparently here in Philadelphia, where these kind of human-like machines that could recreate lifelike behavior, controlled often by these mechanical pins, often playing music. There was a brilliant French automaton creator called Jacques de Vaucanson, and he actually had a famous flute player. Again, I don't know what the deal is with flutes, but it runs all the way through the story. And this, again, was this kind of android, basically, that could be controlled to play this flute, and the well-to-do Parisians would sit around in a maze at this robot boy playing a flute in their drawing room. Vaucanson is also famous for this creation that was really it was kind of the PlayStation of its era, although there was only really one for a while. It was called the digesting duck, and it was an automated, fairly anatomically correct duck that could waddle around and act like a duck and quack like a duck. But if you fed it little pellets of food, it would actually internally process the food and, in fact, defecate out the kind of remains of the food. So it was also known as sometimes the defecating duck. And this is what the Parisian elite did for fun. They didn't have television, they didn't have Facebook, so they were like, well, I guess we can go watch the defecating duck again. Now, Vaucanson did all these extraordinary kind of contraptions. Again, no function whatsoever. They were just amusements. They were just delightful because you've never seen a mechanical duck before, particularly one that defecated. But then at a certain point he began to think, well, wait a second. If we can encode information, instructions to get these little miniature robots to behave in these ways. What if we did that with a loom? What if we did that with weaving? Could we automate the process of weaving and encode the pattern we want to have woven into the fabric into one of these pin cylinders? And so he actually built, in the middle of the 1700s, he built this device that used that exact same pin cylinder that the Banu Musa had developed more than almost 1,000 years before, and created a couple of prototypes of this kind of automated programmable loom. The problem with it was the cylinders were really bulky and expensive to make, and they could only do really repetitive patterns because it was on a cycle, right? Every time it rotated, you had to have the exact same thing once you did a 360-degree rotation. And so it didn't really work, but the idea of a programmable loom kind of got into the consciousness. And about 50 years later, inspired directly by Vaucanson's design, the famous French inventor Jacquard comes up with a modification of that idea, which is to say, let's program the loom not with a rotating metallic pinned cylinder, but rather with holes punched in cards, punch cards, basically. And that creates the Jacquard loom, which is a revolutionary device in terms of the history of textiles and the automation of textile production. But it directly influences Charles Babbage, who invents the first programmable computer, first the difference engine and then the analytical engine in the 1830s in London, and programs these devices, although they don't really ever fully work, with punch cards inspired directly by Jacquard. And in fact, punch cards, some of you may remember, I'm old enough to remember, continued to be a part of computing well into the 1970s. I mean, I'm old enough to remember my third grade classroom, not classroom, but the school I was in third grade, we got a computer, the first computer, and it was programmed with punch cards. Punch cards were a big input-output kind of part of that system. So there is a direct line that connects the experiments of the Banu Musa and the playful exploration of this instrument that plays itself all the way to modern computing. And there are other connections between music and computing as well. Keyboards, think about how important typewriter keyboards, alphanumeric keyboards are to our lives. I mean, now how much time do we spend typing, either on screens or on actual keyboards? A tremendous amount of time now, right? But the idea of an alphanumeric keyboard or a typewriter is one of these strange inventions that seemingly arrived too late. We didn't really have typewriter keyboards until the 1870s, whereas technically we should have been able to have them 200 years before. It's kind of strange that they took so long to show up. But those keyboards came directly from the world of music, from the world of kind of playing music with musical keyboards. The first typewriter was actually called the writing harpsichord. And we'd had musical keyboards for almost 2,000 years. The Romans had musical keyboards with their organs that they had, again, water-powered organs. And then there were clavichords and harpsichords and pianofortes and so on. And then finally, someone said, wait, we could use that not to control notes in music, but to control letters on a page. And the typewriter was born, which then became essential to the computer. So, all of which is to say, when we talk about this incredible revolution in our lives, computers that have changed everything, maybe, with the Industrial Revolution, one of the two most important technological transformations in history. And we ask ourselves, where did it come from? The traditional story is, well, it came from the military was trying to crack the Enigma code, and they were trying to calculate rocket trajectories, and then big companies and Bell Labs were trying to do these things. And all that is true. That is an important, huge part of the story. But it also came from automated flutes and beautiful textile patterns and pianoforte keyboards, harpsichords. And if you only tell the story about the military and forget about that playful musical side, you're really not giving an honest, full account of where this technology came from. Now, on the textile thing, to shift over a little bit to the globalization theme, which of course is already there with the transfer of intellectual ideas from Baghdad to Europe. In the late 1600s, this is one of my favorite stories from the book. In the late 1600s in London, there was this very interesting world-transforming craze that developed among well-to-do women for these extraordinary new fabrics from across the world from India, calico and chintz. These were remarkable fabrics really for two reasons. One, they were made of cotton, which was an extraordinary breakthrough because they could be worn as underwear, which is a big part of the story. Up until that point, everyone basically wore wool underwear in rainy, cold London. You can imagine what that was like. So the idea that you actually had cotton underwear was a big breakthrough. But the big thing, too, was that calico and chintz, thanks to innovations that had come from India, had these beautiful dyes that were much more durable than any other kinds of dyes that Europeans had seen. So they could have these glorious, colorful patterns, and you could wash them multiple times and the patterns wouldn't go away. So they kind of kept their beauty over multiple washings. So you had soft and beautiful fabrics for the first time. Everyone goes crazy for them, both on their bodies, but also as kind of draperies and things like that in their homes and on their couches and things like that. And this creates, somewhat famously, the rise of things like the East India Company, which starts making a vast fortune in importing calico and chintz from India. A big trade deficit opens up between Great Britain and India. But it also creates, and this is a place where we connect directly to the issues of today, it also creates this backlash, a politicized backlash against these women who are buying all these fabrics, because what they are doing, consciously or not, is devastating the internal traditional wool industry of England. And what emerges is basically a kind of make England's wool industry great industry, kind of movement. I don't know if they had hats, but they did write. One thing we didn't get, they wrote all these poems and screeds and pamphlets and plays and songs denouncing these women for buying these kind of sensual fabrics that were destroying literally the fabric of England. And the women were shamed, basically. They were called calico madams. And there was this kind of interesting gendered kind of analysis of their sensual interest in these exotic fabrics from the Far East that was destroying England's traditional economies. And so this big backlash kind of erupts in battle. Calico and chintz are briefly banned from English shores altogether. But at the same time, another group of inventors and engineers and entrepreneurs start to think, well, wait a second, what if we tried to make some of these cotton-based fabrics here inside of England using new steam-powered technology and our understanding of some of these early forms of automation? And that is the birth of the Industrial Revolution. And the industrialization was driven by cotton and by textile production for most of that first half a century or so. And of course, just think of the impact of cotton on the United States and the history of slavery in this country. So again, the way that we traditionally tell the story of industrialization is, well, there are these brilliant engineers and inventors who come up with this new steam-powered technology to create these new automated looms, and the world changes, and eventually everyone gets wealthy enough that this upper middle class develops that likes to go shopping, and they start to go to department stores in the 19th century, and that becomes a kind of fringe benefit of industrialization and modern capitalism. But in fact, that story kind of has it the wrong way around. Yes, the entrepreneurs and the inventors were a big part of it, but it really starts with this moment of intrigue, with this new fabric, the touch of the fabric, the visual appeal of the fabric. And that initial moment of intrigue then sets in motion this vast chain of events that ends up leading to industrialization, leading to the extension of American slavery into the 1850s, kind of leads directly in some ways to the Civil War. So again, that moment of delight and amusement is a central part of the story, and we distort the story if we don't include it. Now, it's important, and I would hope obvious to point out here, and I spent a lot of time in the book talking about this, that just because this book is a look at it and appreciation for the importance of delight and wonder and play, it doesn't necessarily mean that those things are always resulting in happy consequences, right? The impact of cotton on slavery. I have a whole chapter in the book on the history of the spice trade, which of course is central to the story of globalization. All these cloves and cinnamon and nutmeg, these flavors that had no real nutritional value, that were at some point some of the most expensive objects in the world. and that created, in a real sense, the first global marketplace, also led to terrible examples of exploitation and slavery. So it is not always, by any means, a happy story, but it does start with this human interest in delight and in play and in wonder. I'll tell you just one other kind of set of examples from another category on the kind of political side of this, and then we can open it up for conversation and question. Sometimes when we use the language of innovation, we focus on kind of technological breakthroughs or scientific breakthroughs or gadgets and things like that, or automated flute players or whatever it is. But sometimes innovations are more conceptual or more architectural, the innovation of certain types of institution. I mean, a library is a great innovation, right, that changed the world. It didn't necessarily, at some points it's involved technology, but it's more about defining a space and the purpose of a space. And the final chapter of Wonderland looks at a number of these different spaces. Just think of the number of institutions that we now have around us that are devoted to creating a space where we can enjoy ourselves and kick back and have some fun, from movie theaters to amusement parks, to science museums, to bars and taverns, and the whole gamut of IMAX theaters. All the world is filled with all these spaces, many of which did not exist 200 or 300 years ago, that now kind of surround us at all different points. And the creation of those spaces has actually been very influential over time. One of them is the coffee house, the creation of the coffee house. I'm not going to go into this story because I'm so obsessed with the history of the coffee house that I've written about it in 4 books, including Invention of Air, where I first wrote about it. But the coffee house just transformed the culture of Enlightenment England, particularly Enlightenment London, in the late 1600s and early 1700s, mid 1700s. Transformative space in terms of ideas and politics and science. Almost all of the great ideas in that period involve a coffee house conversation at some point or another. But an even older institution that is crucial to our history, that sometimes gets bad press, is taverns and pubs. In fact, the tavern may be the first kind of play space, Wonderland-like space, a space that's carved out specifically. This is not home, this is not a church, this is not just an open field, this is not work. This is a space where you go to unwind, have a drink, mingle with people, maybe meet somebody new. The kind of social boundaries are a little bit more fluid, and you're there to kind of relax and have a good time. That was a pretty good invention. I think most of us can agree. But it has been it's an ancient invention. It's old, certainly as old as Roman times and even older. But it's a big part of the history of this country, right? The tavern culture was an essential part of the story of the American Revolution. If it was the place where people gathered to read the Declaration of Independence aloud. It was common sense was read aloud in taverns. Hamilton pretty much starts in a tavern, the musical, so it must be important. And it, no doubt, the American Revolution would have happened had taverns not been invented. But I'm not trying to overstate the argument here for the importance of it. But if taverns hadn't been around, the revolution would have required a different kind of social network or places to gather to facilitate the sharing of ideas, the sharing of kind of revolutionary sentiment, the organizing, all the stuff that happened in these kind of semi-public, semi-private spaces of the tavern, where, in part because of the booze and in part just because of the general kind of institutional conventions, the norms of tavern behavior, new ideas were allowed to be expressed in a way that they weren't in other places like a church. So the tavern is a big part of our political history. And just think about things like the gay rights movement, right? I mean, that you can't tell the story of the gay rights movement without focusing on the bars like the Stonewall Tavern in Greenwich Village or the Black Cat in LA. Those were spaces where, for precisely the same reasons, the alcohol and that semi-public, semi-private space allowed people to experiment with a new kind of public identity that other spaces did not allow. And so the tavern has always been a space where kind of inappropriate ideas or ideas that are ahead of their time are first given voice, or identities or particular political viewpoints are kind of spoken aloud or shared in those kinds of spaces. So it's a really important innovation as well, as important as the high-tech ones we normally celebrate. And the final point on that is an even bigger transformation, which is the transformation of seeing nature itself as a kind of wonderland. This too was a kind of creation and invention, because up until, again, this period, 1700, 1800, if you go back and read the way that Europeans spoke about nature, and a lot of American writers at the time too, nature was actually something that we thought very antagonistically about. People who had kind of managed to build civilization and cities, nature was this threatening thing. One of the most comical riffs in the whole book is, up until the 1800s, most Europeans considered mountains to be incredibly hideous. They were kind of offended by the sight of these terrifying structures, and people who were taking carriage rides by the Alps would actually ask to be blindfolded on occasion to avoid accidentally seeing these monstrous forms in the distance, right? Which kind of made sense, since nature was a place that would kill you if you just went out into raw nature, whereas the city or the town was a place where you could survive and food was reliable and there were no predators who were going to attack you, or dragons. People believed that there were dragons in the Alps until quite recently. I'm sure there are some people who still believe there are dragons in the Alps. It's fake news that they're not dragons in the Alps. But all that started to change, and again, this was a kind of invention in and of itself. The invention of nature is something to be savored and enjoyed, that one could have an aesthetic relationship with, and the kind of romantics played a part in this. There were people, this guy Saussure, who was a big champion of mountaineering, and set up this prize for who could climb some of the peaks in the Alps. And so suddenly, and he wrote these stories, and there were these kind of performances that were put on where people would simulate the kind of ascent of the Matterhorn or whatever mountain it was. And so all of a sudden nature becomes this aesthetic experience, this space of delight and of wonder, not a space to be feared. And a number of funny practices develop, one of which is they had this device called the clawed glass. And the clawed glass was a little mirror that you would kind of tip up when you went to visit one of these spectacular places in real life. And the mirror was cracked with these tiny little etched cracks on it. And so they would go to the site of whatever it is, the beautiful mountain view or the waterfall, and they would turn around and look at the image in the mirror. And with the little cracks, it looked kind of like a oil painting. And so they would turn this view that they were sitting and looking at, and they would look at it rather through this little mirror to create the feeling like it had been turned into a painting. For those of you who follow this, it was basically an Instagram filter, 150 years ahead of the time. But it was this you can just imagine people there like, the waterfall is there. Why are you looking at this tiny little low-res, distorted version of it? But people wanted to turn it into this aesthetic pursuit. But that process led, again, directly to the creation of the first national parks, to Yosemite and Yellowstone, and to the preservation of lands all around the world, which as of 8:05 are still preserved. We'll see. I haven't checked Twitter in a while. Sorry, I'm trying to keep it clean here, folks, but it's hard. And then finally it led to, one of the most extraordinary kind of wonderlands of the modern world that we should spend more time celebrating, which is the creation of urban parks all around the world, where you had these spaces deliberately carved out for play, for recreation, for the pleasure of just walking around. They were not seats of commerce. They were not residences. They belonged to everyone. Sometimes they were filled with zoos and boating and, on a lake and other, and then eventually soccer fields and all the like. But that was an extraordinary creation too, that we had these spaces carved out specifically for people to just unwind and enjoy a little slice of nature or camaraderie with their fellow citizens in a big teeming city. So I live most of the year in Brooklyn, and we live just 2 blocks from Prospect Park, the great other Olmsted Park in New York City besides Central Park. And I kind of end the main torso of this book with this little reverie about going to Prospect Park on a 4th of July and hanging out and looking at the crowd that's gathered there on a 4th of July. And it's this really extraordinary achievement because you see, every culture in the world hanging out, sharing this space together. It's civil, it's playful, it's safe. And it's funny with kind of 4th of July imagery, with the thing that we tend to, the kind of iconic image of the 4th of July in this country, appropriately in this country, is that kind of small town look with the fire truck going down the main street and the bunting on the little white picket fence and stuff like that. But in a way, that's not a real breakthrough. That's not a great achievement. History is filled with small communities where everybody more or less looks alike and knows everybody, that reasonably get along. That is an old story. That's as old as tribes. What's a new story is the creation of these public spaces in cities of 2 million or 10 million or 20 million, where all the citizens of the world are gathered together, clustered together, in a sense the culmination of that process that began millennia before with the first stirrings of the spice trade, bringing us all into one global market. And all those citizens from all those places around the world hanging out at leisure, that is really a great achievement. That's the kind of thing we should be celebrating now, probably more than ever. The sight of all those people together at peace with each other and at play. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a great talk.
Thanks.
I have a question, I guess, or sort of a comment, sort of a question. And it's, you said originally that play is something that is innately human. And in thinking about that, it seems that it goes beyond just human. I mean, you look at dogs, kittens, cats. I mean, it's something that's a function of creatures in general. Do you have any idea of like what the function of play is?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. I'm glad you brought it up. One of the things that's interesting is it's not a function of all life. There's a very big gap between creatures who show a propensity for play, particularly in early childhood, and most of the creatures that live in the world. Generally, mammals play more than anything else. So you see it in puppies, and you see it in dolphins, and there, even within mammals, there seems to be a correlation between the amount of childhood time devoted to play and the ultimate kind of flexible problem solving of that animal when it matures into an adult. Human beings have the longest childhood and the most play. We're really good at play, and kids will just spontaneously play. You give them, those of you who've had kids or been a child yourself, which I'm pretty sure is most of you, will remember. If not, I'd like to meet one of you who was never a child. You just give them a block and it's, I've invented this game. And so it seems to be that there's something about the experience of play that basically causes you, what makes play is it's unpredictable, right? You don't, a game where you always know how it's going to turn out. Wow, that was very voice of God. Where you always know how it's going to turn out is not a game, right? What makes it interesting is you don't know what's going to happen. You're not sure where it's going to go. There's chance involved, and it's surprising. And in playing the game, you're devising new strategies on the fly. So other forms of maturation or turning it into an adult are about, these are the fixed rules. This is what you need to be able to do. You need to be able to breathe, and you need to be able to eat food. But the part of the world that involves, I need to creatively solve this problem that no one's encountered before because the world is constantly changing. Well, play is a wonderful way to rehearse for that. It puts the mind in this kind of open-ended, receptive state to new possibilities, and it's a kind of exploratory state. And that's one of the reasons why, I'm sure other people might have questions about this, why there's a growing movement to think about play in the classroom and think about, for instance, games as a teaching device that's much more effective in some ways than a traditional lecture, as much as I love a traditional lecture. But once you get into that game state, kids will learn without having any realization that they're learning because they're so interested in the game. They soak up all this information that they wouldn't necessarily soak up if they were just listening to somebody speak.
Does it seem to you that there's less play going on in today's young generation? We think about the playground seems safer than usual, and parents are always structuring play for their children, and why don't we, maybe a lot of parents want to make it as easy as possible for their children in playing.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, I think about this a lot as a parent. On the one hand, I think there is. I did a conversation we have a podcast for this book if you want to check it out, and that builds on a lot of these themes and goes into more of these kind of contemporary issues as well, not just the history. And I had a great conversation with Stuart Brand, the legendary founder of the Whole Earth Catalog and writer of many great books, and he was talking about how one of the things that's really interesting about kids when they start to play, until they get kind of institutionalized into things like Little League or whatever it is, that their form of play, so much of what play is inventing the rules, right? That when you sit there with your friends and you're like, okay, here's the rule, we're gonna play this ball game, and if you bounce it 3 times off this wall, then you're out. But if you know that, and a lot of the fun of it is, okay, let's tinker with the rules, come up with new rules. And then you get kind of codified into these, well, the official rules of baseball as defined by Abner Doubleday, whatever. So that kind of creative side of inventing the rules, probably there's a little bit less of that for the reasons that you point to, that we have more kind of structured time. On the other hand, there is incredible stuff happening, first off, in terms of just playing games. If you include video games in that kind of pantheon of games, then they're playing more games than ever. And I can say that as a parent of 3 basically teenage boys. They're playing plenty of games. There's no shortage of games in our household. The question is, how do you feel about those games? And some of them are incredibly creative, like a game like Minecraft that all of our kids have played, where you're going into this whole world, you're inventing a whole world, you're inventing the rules of that world. Sometimes you're inventing kind of almost the physics of the world. And you're effectively learning how to program while you're doing this kind of world building, hanging out with other people in this kind of shared space, designing it, building buildings, building creatures, building rules for how everything should interact. Incredibly open-ended. No discernible, a kind of an older generation person sits down with Minecraft and they're like, okay, how do you win? And it's like, you can't win. It's just this alternate world that you create as you play. So there's immense creativity that goes into that kind of screen activity and open-ended creativity. But in terms of sitting around the playground and inventing a game with your pals, I suspect there's probably not enough of that.
Thank you very much for some very thought-provoking ideas.
Good.
You make me think that play should be studied much more carefully, and I don't know if that's happening. Do you?
There is some interesting work going on. In fact, there's an episode of the podcast that talked about it. I mean, I talk a little bit about, in the very end of the book, there's a kind of an epilogue about speculating a little bit about the brain science behind it. Some of it clearly comes out of we have a deep-seated kind of wiring to be interested in surprising things, right? So our brains are set up so that if we make a prediction about the world and the world does not, behave in the way that we predicted, we pay attention. We get this kind of jolt of like, what was that? Okay, and that's how kind of learning happens in many ways. And what you can see, all of these experiences basically are kind of controlled surprise. So music is controlled surprise, right? It's the song that you are sick of, you're sick of it because it's no longer surprising. The song that's completely dissonant and you have no idea where it's going is not interesting to your ear because you can't even make a prediction about what it's going to do. So the sweet spot is surprising but not too surprising. And so over time, culture has come up with all of these devices to hit that sweet spot. And one of the reasons why, this is the big argument at the end of the book, one of the reasons why so much innovation has come out of play is that sweet spot is constantly moving. Because one generation's surprise is the next generation's normal, right? They're like, well, we've always had flutes. We need something else. Invent electric guitars, And so we're constantly having to kind of push the boundaries of surprise in provocative new ways. And so that leads us to all these new technologies or ideas of programmable flute players and all the things that I was talking about. So that's a big part of it. There's some interesting kind of brain scan fMRI experiments with people who are playing video games, for instance, and watching what happens to their brains. It actually is quite positive, the results. Their visual intelligence improves dramatically. And there is a growing field of kind of research into what it means in the classroom and into education, but there's a lot more to be done for sure.
increasingly, we see a lot of tech companies that are trying to cultivate, a culture and an atmosphere of play.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, as a way to spur innovation, just wondering if you have an opinion on, what they're doing right and what they're missing.
Yeah, terrific question. So I think that a lot of times I think people misunderstand what's going on at the campuses of, the Googles of the world when they hear about or visit, and there's, the foosball table, and there's, volleyball out in the middle of the courtyard and everything, and they kind of think of it as, oh, they have all these toys and playful spaces because that's a perk of getting to work at Google. The company is so successful that they can afford to and they have to attract the best talent, and so they can afford to build a stupid volleyball table, whereas the rest of us people were just trying to make a profit. The volleyball field is the first thing to go. I think it's the other way around. I think there has always been in the tech sector, particularly in the Bay Area tech sector, which I spent a lot of time in because we live some of the year out there. There's a long tradition of play being part of your work, and if you look at just the kind of hobbyist culture that led to the personal computer revolution, video games were central to the early days of personal computer. Steve Jobs worked at Atari, the first video game company, before he started Apple. So play was always there. It wasn't a perk in a sense. I think one of the reasons why those companies are so successful is that they have created a culture where play is recognized as part of the kind of the creative imagination. You have to give the mind time to play, or else it's not going to come up with really interesting new ideas. I think it sometimes gets carried away a little too far. I mean, I've spent a lot of time at Google. There are foosball tables everywhere. I actually have never seen anyone playing foosball. I think that's just a big fiction that they have. But I was visiting Etsy. Some of you probably know Etsy, the great kind of marketplace of artisanal or individually made handcrafted goods. And they have headquarters near where we live in Brooklyn, and I went to visit them also in the podcast. I'm sorry to shill the podcast so much. But and they have a big theme about music there, because I guess if you're 27 and you work for Etsy in Brooklyn, by definition you have an indie rock band that you also play. And so all through there, instead of foosball tables, there are musical instruments everywhere. And they actually have kind of a band room where there's a little mini recording studio, and it's kind of sealed so you can play music pretty loud with drums and stuff like that, and it's not going to disturb everyone else. But there are guitars everywhere, and there's a grand piano in one place, and the whole idea is do some work, get some stuff done, and then take 30 minutes and go jam with your pals for on a song, and then come back refreshed and creative and ready to do something else. And I thought that was really lovely. I'd never seen such a musical office. I think that would be good to see more of that.
Well, I hadn't prepared this question, and it's multi-layered, so I'm going to try to simplify it.
Okay.
Because my mind is processing everything you're saying, and my concern is the future and also the present. I feel like there's so much information it's impossible to process on a daily basis.
Yeah.
I almost wish I never had email.
Right.
I wish I never had my bank accounts online. So all this is changing. The convenience is kind of scary now.
Yeah.
So are you noticing a trend is this getting to be a big cloud, or I don't even know what to call it, but of fear and disassociation? And that goes to it also, the social network that you spoke of earlier seems to be expanding.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it was a pretty interesting year for technology. I have been, as you probably can tell, or if you've read some of my books, my default state is generally pretty upbeat and optimistic, and I tend to think we don't talk enough about long-term progress in society. We celebrate kind of short-term things like, oh, there's a new iPhone, but the kind of long-term story of progress is something we don't talk enough about. And so a lot of my books have been trying to kind of remind people of what life was like 150 years ago when, for instance, my book, The Ghost Map, when you could easily die of cholera in a big city anywhere in Europe or the United States just from drinking water. You could be dead in 3 days. So there are a lot of things that we have kind of solved thanks to science and thanks to technology. But I think there's a sense this year, that the election was bound up in a lot of ways, where particularly the tech sector and the internet and social media was making everybody a little crazy, and it was a little bit out of control. And you know, whether it was the kind of the echo chambers you get at Facebook, where everybody's just talking to people of their own persuasion and amping themselves up, or importantly, I think people don't point this out enough, the exact opposite of that at Twitter, where you have people yelling at each other. It's the opposite of an echo chamber, but they're giving you death threats because you've dared to say something that supports Trump or supports Hillary. And the fake news and the hacking, just all of this suddenly seems like, whoa, this thing is kind of spiraling out of control a little bit. And I felt it as an advocate for this world. And I'm wrestling with that a little bit in the next book that I'm working on, which is about long-term decision making and how we can do it better collectively, can do it better, and personally can do it better, it's a tricky skill. And one of the things that's come up in a couple of op-eds that people have written, including by Walter Isaacson, who wrote the great book about Franklin, is the argument that the internet is kind of broken structurally, and there are some things about its design that 40 years later we probably need to kind of upgrade, that have led to some of the problems that we've seen. And maybe it's time to kind of reset and think about actually what the technology, how it should be designed to better facilitate communication and politics and all this kind of stuff. But that raises the interesting question of, let's say we wanted to fix the internet. How do we decide what should go into the next version? And what would be the process for that? And that's one of the things that I'm kind of wrestling with in this next book. So I'll come back in a year and tell you what I figured out. Okay.
Would you speak about Wonderland as a concept? You used it in passing during this evening's presentation. So what does it mean to you?
Well, I mean, it kind of has a general title-y meaning, and then it has a specific meaning in that last chapter. So the specific meaning in that last chapter are those spaces, like the tavern, the city park, the national park, that are specific kind of places that are carved out where one can be playful, escape from work, escape from home, escape from the church, and unwind and relax and have a kind of moment of delight in some way. So I think of those as kind of little mini wonderlands. There's a big chapter also about these optical illusion palaces that were prominent in the early 1900s, like the Phantasmagoria and the Panorama and all these crazy places where you would go in and immerse yourself, which led to the cinema, which is itself a kind of wonderland. So there's a specific sense of, and I could have written in some sense in a whole book on those kinds of spaces. But then I also just wanted a title that was kind of evocative and suggested a sense of playfulness and wonder. But it does have that, kind of underpinning of illusion and the retreat from reality, and losing touch with what is real to escape in this world of wonder and illusion. And I think that's kind of where we are in a way as a society right now, in the sense that part of the march of progress is that we've created all these wonderful spaces where we can amuse ourselves and experience that human appetite for delight, and that's a fantastic thing. But it does also sometimes distract us from the real issues and keep us from really focusing on the threats or the challenges or the hard choices that we have to make. So it's not a utopian story by any means. All right, thank you all. So great questions. Thank you for coming out. I'll be out there signing if you want. Thanks a lot.